I have a few more folks who would like to speak, and then we can take time for some questions. First, I'd like to introduce Jonathan Leavitt from the Maine Marijuana Policy Initiative.
About 4.5 years ago, we created the Maine Marijuana Policy Initiative to essentially try to address the question of marijuana prohibition here in the state of Maine. And over the last 4.5 years, we've had some success moving forward on the question of medical marijuana, making sure medical marijuana patients have their medicine, have full access to their medicine with Question 5. And most recently, we were able to create a trade association that now represents over 150 people who are caregivers, licensed caregivers in the state, who produce medical marijuana for qualified patients. To see this next step actually come into fruition, and to see an elected official who has enough guts and integrity to stand up and tell you what other elected officials say when they're off camera makes us pretty happy. In addition, not just the fact that we're having an open discussion around the question of ending the policy of marijuana prohibition, but that the vision behind and the details behind this law are what's really important. Many of the proposals put forward in the country right now around inevitably the question of legalization have to do with a very simple tax and regulate scheme in which this is put out on the open market and allowing people with big money, big corporations to come in and control this market. The vision that Representative Russell's bill represents is a different one. It's what we're doing here in Maine already with licensed caregivers, where we're creating a horizontal framework, an economic framework that ranges from east to west, from north to south. Small farmers who do this and do it better than any large corporation can do. And the idea that we're going to move forward in Maine with a vision behind legalization is as important as the fact that we're actually ready now to deal with the question of legalization. So I encourage people to hear about, to look into the framework, how this is going to move forward on a way which works for small farmers, allows people to stay in their communities, to have a job where they can pay their bills, they can send their kids to college, they can pay taxes. So as we move forward, we want to stay focused on those details and make sure, again, what emerges here is what works really well in Maine, which is small-scale agriculture done by people you know in your community, who you can put a face to, who you can be held accountable to. That's how we want to move forward here in Maine. And we're not interested in opening this up for the kind of economics that we've seen tear this country and this world asunder. So I applaud Representative Russell for actually having those kind of details in this, and for Maine moving forward in a way which actually we can be proud of. So.
Next, I want to introduce Zach Heidan from the Maine Civil Liberties Union. Zach?
Thank you, Representative Russell. Thank you all for being here. My name is Zachary Heidan. I am the legal director at the Maine Civil Liberties Union, and I'm here today because over-incarceration is one of the great civil rights struggles of our time. Maine needs to use its resources wisely, and locking people up, spending money and energy on people who use marijuana is not sensible, and it is not sustainable. The United States incarcerates more of its citizens, by far, than any other country in the world. Though we make up 5% of the world's population, the United States is responsible for nearly 25% of the world's prisoners. And nearly 500,000 people are behind bars in this country because of drug charges. That's more people than all of Western Europe locks up for all offenses. Filling our prisons and jails with drug offenders has done nothing to reduce drug use, dependence, or availability. All it has accomplished is to redirect valuable and scarce resources away from serious crime and to create unintended consequences. When someone is locked up for a drug charge, that person is less likely to be able to get a good job. They're less able to get good housing. They're less able to get loans for education. And all of that makes it less likely that they are going to be productive members of society. It's time for us to rethink the failed war on drugs, and this bill is an important step in the right direction. Thank you very much for being here.
And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce a retired attorney who lives here in Portland, here in Scarborough area, Chris Johnson.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Chris Johnson, and I'm not a Democrat, and I'm not a Republican. I'm none of those things. I've had two careers in my life. I taught in schools, in the public school system of the city of New York, and also in a very affluent area nearby called Westchester County. I dealt with adolescents between 12 and 19 years old. I saw remarkable things in that time, some good and some bad. Subsequently, I became an attorney. I worked in financial services for 30 years. I worked with very large corporations and some small businesses, fellows struggling, trying to find a way to create value and jobs in struggling economies. A couple months ago, I met an enormously attractive lady, Diane Russell. I'm not a misogynist. I don't mean enormously attractive in that sense. Diane Russell has the uncanny ability to wrap her head around issues instead of naked vocabulary and sound bites. She looks at things from a perspective that I think would be refreshing to most legislators in this country who are now fumbling around, trying to find a way to bring us out of a very difficult time, both socially and economically. And when she told me that she was proposing a bill, the title of which, for the first time, had little to do with fancy words that really meant the opposite of what they were saying, she introduced a bill, the number of which I believe is 1453, and its label is quite simple: an act to legalize and tax marijuana. Now, I thought that was a stroke of genius, because in case you don't know it, the history of this rather modest little plant goes back thousands of years, and it wasn't until the turn of the 20th century in this country that two things happened, and they happened almost simultaneously. An allusion was made to prohibition, which, as we know, had to do with alcohol, but there was another cause, and that cause had to do with the same essential ingredient, and that was a sense of overbearing morality. Marijuana, for the first time in the United States, was precluded from distribution because of the fear that people would have too good a time using it. Just like alcohol, just like dancing, just like raucous music. It was a paradigm of something sinister that had no basis in reality, but made good press. That was reinforced in the 1930s when, for other reasons, the Marijuana Act was passed in Washington, D.C., largely through the efforts of gentlemen named Carnegie, Mellon, and DuPont. Now, why did I hesitate with DuPont? Because at the same time that bill was passed, enormous funds were flowing from very large corporations, especially the DuPont Corporation, which had just created a miracle fiber, nylon, and hemp, an incredibly valuable part of this strange little weed, represented a threat to the revenue stream that the DuPont Corporation was going to recognize through prohibiting sales. The consequences of those acts has resulted today in two components that I want to address briefly. As an educator, I saw children. I was in the inner city. I was in the lily-white suburbs. And there was absolutely no difference that I could see in the incidence of the use of this little drug in any of those communities. There were a lot of other differences, but that wasn't one, and universally, those children suffered because what they were doing represented a criminal activity. They were frequently arrested, what they say busted, ended up with criminal records. Some of them spent time in jail, which, by the way, as a teenager who's made a mistake, ain't a great place to be, because you learn some stuff there that maybe you shouldn't have oughta wanted to learn in the first place. In my business transactions, when I left education and went into the law, I represented very, very large corporations and also some small businesses, and every single time my job was to analyze laws, look at business structures, and figure out for young entrepreneurs and some elderly entrepreneurs how they could best bring new products to markets, generate revenue, create jobs, and make society function. Well, this odd little plant has a unique ability. It already exists. The markets are there. The consumers don't have to be sold on a product that they ought to buy. But more importantly, there is a revenue stream for states and federal governments to raise more money through taxes than for any other cash product that exists. Think about that. And this is an agricultural product in an era where farms and indigenous jobs are disappearing every time you blink your eye. Ms. Russell's bill incorporates two components that I think are stunning. The first is the recognition that to criminalize behavior which exists without harm is wrong, that it overburdens the legal community because it requires absolute dedication of men and resources to investigation, to prosecution, to trials, to judicial time. It overburdens prison populations, which we're already talking about farming out because there's too many people for us to handle. And at the same time, it brings to the state of Maine, or any other state that cares to do so, an increase on the revenue side as opposed to cuts on the cost side. That's the thing our politicians have been universally missing. You don't address physical crisis by looking to cut essential services. What you do is find new revenue sources. And I want to applaud you for having put your finger on that. Thank you.